I'd like to welcome you all to the learning session this morning. It's a webinar. It'll be presented by Jane Whiffin, who is an independent reviewer, a very experienced person who's done many child reviews over the years. She's going to be talking about the baby's first home, in brackets the womb, just to identify that's what we're talking about, unborn children as well. If you can keep yourselves muted, as I said, keep yourselves the cameras off. We're going to be recording the session. I don't know if that started yet, but Derry is going to record the session. So if anybody's unhappy with that, I say keep your cameras off. If you need to leave, that's fine. There will be a registration, a link in the chat, which Derry is going to put in. We need you to register in there so that we can send you the recording afterwards for those that want it. And also later on, there'll be an evaluation added to the chat, which we'll ask you to do before you leave the session. So I'm going to hand you over now to Jane Whiffin. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Gary. Thanks very much. Yeah, welcome to this session, and apologies for people who were going to come to the last session. The dreaded and horrible COVID got me, so we've had to rearrange. So very good to be here. And I'm going to put up a presentation in a minute, and so when I do that, I can't see anybody's hands up. I can't see anything in the chat, so I will come to that at the break. And just to say, I was saying to Daria, who organised the and in many ways there's sort of unconscious processes around that, and I had the most bizarre dream last night about this presentation, in that I dreamt that I was doing it in person, because that's starting to happen, and that when I turned up, I had a baby with me, because it's baby's first home, and so I was holding the baby, and everybody, the radio was on in this place, everybody's running around. I was trying to get the presentation on, and then a little child came and poured a juice all over my computer, so the whole thing crashed, including the presentation. So I don't know what that means, but it just tells you that doing presentations about babies is a bit anxiety provoking. So let's do this from the start. So as Gary says, I'm going to be talking about baby's first home in the womb, and really it's focusing on the learning from serious case reviews and local safeguarding practice reviews. As Gary says, that's largely what I do, although I was a social worker. I do a little bit of work for the Centre of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse, and all of that kind of comes together to kind of think about particular areas of practice. So the session today is 10 till 12. I'll do a presentation till about 5 to 11. It's a little bit inexact, just because it depends if I've got to where I need to, so it might be just a little after that. We'll have a break for 15 minutes so that we can get up, have a coffee, tea, whatever, walk around, and then I'll carry on presenting, and then we'll have some opportunity, hopefully 11:40 till 12, questions and comments. There's some, I'm getting some feedback. Just to say, I think all these subjects around safeguarding are tough. They're tough for us working with it. They're tough for us hearing about it. So I think it's, and this thinking about the unborn baby, it's something very visceral about it. And so I want you to take care, look after yourselves. And as I say, I will pause if I need to, but I can't see the chat, so I'll take questions just before the break. So why this seminar? You know, this seminar was prompted by a recent Leicestershire local child safeguarding practice review, a very sad one actually, about a baby who died at age 8 as a result of a large administered dose of prescribed morphine. We don't know in what circumstances that happened. Baby was living at home with mother and grandmother, and that is subject to some inquiries. So the baby's mother had a traumatic past, and one of the things we found is, and that we'll come to talk about as we go through, is the impact of this in the present was not well understood, and that seemed to be very important. She experienced depression, and the impact on her current reflective functioning, future attachment, and feelings about the unborn baby were not well understood or analysed. She had a very long-term drug dependency on both methadone and illegal street drugs, and was found during pregnancy to be sex working to fund that significant habit. But we talked about in the review, and I'll talk about as we go through, we don't know why, what was the need that long-term drug dependency met, and why was it so difficult to give up even when wanting to. She was prescribed methadone and was provided with a lot of support from her GP and a social worker and a whole range of other people. She used other drugs, as I've said, and there was an undue focus of possible or likely future harm, not what the harm was today. What was life like for this baby? And I'm going to have, and this kind of is what prompted me to start talking about what's life like for the baby in the womb. There was concern about withdrawal and coping with a withdrawing baby. I don't probably have enough time to tell you a lot about that, but that's just something we need to think about. And the kind of unborn baby was not seen particularly as a child we should be concerned about. So because we can't see the baby, and this mother wasn't particularly focused on the baby as a being, as professionals, there was a sense in which we were talking about mum and mother, but we weren't, and grandmother, but we weren't talking about the baby. And that's something we need to think about. Her father was domestically abusive. Just to say, mother was white British, father was Black Asian, Black Asian British, and he was domestically abusive. And in this review, there was good action regarding safety, but less analysis on the impact of domestic abuse on the unborn baby, maternal well-being and maternal sense of self. The evidence of coercion and control needed further exploration. And just to say, really, this baby's circumstances are not unusual. I've done several reviews around babies who've just been born and who have been harmed by their parents. And really that's prompted us today to kind of share a whole range of information with you. I have to say I've got millions of slides. I will skip over them, but I put them together for you. So there's quite a lot of information there, and there's quite a lot of resources at the end. Kind of context for this is that almost a half of all serious case reviews involve a child under 1, and a substantial proportion of those are babies of 3 months or younger. So these are newborn babies largely. The proportion of newborn babies under a week old becoming subject to care proceedings has risen from 32% to 42% in the last 10 years. Between 8 to 12% of all children subject to child protection plans aged under 1. It's the most common neglect is the most common category of abuse, and 40% of newborn babies are born are subject to care proceedings who are born to mothers who had previously have children removed. And there is considerable concern about parents who've experienced recurrent care proceedings, often as many as 5 lots, and the multiple removals of children. There's a whole other seminar we could do about the multiple recurrent care proceedings and multiple removals of children. I'm only going to say a little bit about that, but that very much is the kind of where we are in this world of thinking about the unborn baby and thinking about their future, and what's the impact for them. And in England and Wales, under 1s face around 8 times the average risk of child homicide. Just to say, there are people waiting in the lobby. Darren. Great. what sort of harm are we seeing for these very young children? Largely, it's around non-accidental head injury. It's the most common cause of infant death, and sudden infant death syndrome as a connected outcome. And the national panel recently did a national review looking at non-accidental head injury, and I've added the link to that in the slides later, which you'll get, and it's worth having a look for the role of men. Again, not something I'm going to cover today. So what am I going to cover? So I'm going to start with considering the world of the unborn baby in the womb, their first home, thinking about what's the impact on the unborn baby living in that home of drugs, alcohol, domestic abuse, depression, anxiety. Thinking a little bit about change, and I've got a little bit of an exercise for you to do, so you'll all need a pen and paper at the very least. Going to do a little bit of thinking about trauma and its impact, and then go on to pre-birth assessment planning, just to think about some key issues about what's important to consider. I think it's just really important to say that, you know, thinking about the unborn baby is a complex area of practice in a number of different ways. It's a sad area of practice, partly because we're often talking about cyclical patterns where babies and children did not get their needs met, and this impacts on their future parenting. So we're kind of going to talk a bit about that. And this is really particularly challenging where parents have been in the care of the state, where parents are care experienced individuals, and they were not provided with good enough corporate parenting. They experienced multiple placement moves and had to form trusting relationships with multiple professionals. So it's not surprising that they bring trauma into kind of pregnancy and future parenting. It's not surprising they bring some of that lack of trust, you know, lack of emotional regulation with them. And in the past, we've had quite a sort of victim blaming approach where children receive labels such as that they are damaged, or they're difficult, or they're dangerous, they have poor behaviour, they're emotionally dysregulated, making it sound like there's something wrong with them, rather than this is as a result of what has happened to them as a result of their care experiences. And many of those serious case reviews will, you know, our one didn't, but will have care experienced individuals. So we need to start by saying we're going to change our language. I keep joking that I'm going to break into loads of local authority buildings and change all the language of care experienced individuals to think about that they aren't damaged. They've been living in damaging circumstances. They're not, their behaviour isn't a problem. It's that they have not been helped to manage their behaviour, and their behaviour is a communication of distress, to helping us to understand what's going on for them. And there is considerable evidence of the impact of this labelling of their trauma as somehow internally problematic to them into adulthood. And it's really, really important that we have enough time to step back and think, what is this behaviour? What is it communicating to me? And what does that mean? And think about what were these children not given as children that is present in as adults. The other thing about the unborn baby is that it cuts across issues of mothering and women's sense of guilt. So don't have that bit of blue cheese, don't have that bit of Gouda, you can't drink, you can't do this, you can't do that. And, you know, I'm hoping we can have some of these conversations without that. And it does cut across notions of reproductive choices, which have been challenging across the world, and women choosing not to continue with pregnancy. And these choices, you know, from my perspective, need to be respected. And so nothing I'm saying is undermining of that. But if we have parents who want to have their baby, they're going ahead with the pregnancy, we then need to focus on the unbaby as a human entity with a personality, a need for care, to be protected from harm, to be loved, and to help parents form early attachments before the baby is born. One of the real challenges here is that the unborn baby does not have any legal rights until it's born. You can't start care proceedings, and parents, particularly the mother, can make choices for the unborn baby, which will have implications for the baby. But the baby does have civil rights under safeguarding procedures, and I think it's just really, really important that we remember that. Final thing on this is just a bit of a word about shame, that we need to be having some of these conversations without evoking shame. It's a really difficult thing to do, because I'm going to talk about drugs and alcohol and what that means for the unborn baby, and that does invoke feelings of shame. And I'm going to encourage us all to think about invoking feelings of love and care for the baby, and that's why we're talking about these matters, and I'll come and talk about that. And that the importance of relationships as part of that is absolutely critical, that we need to be able to do this work, particularly for care experienced young people who form a large part of this population, because they have had such kind of unstable relationships caused by placement moves, change of professional, having more professionals in their lives than family, their links not being maintained. So let's think about the importance of relationships when we have this. Now I'm going to show you a video, so I'm going to stop sharing. Now this is quite a complicated matter. You have to press include system audio to get this. Gary, can you see that?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
And can you tell me if you can hear it when I play it?
Okay, wait.
Yes.
Yes.
This is my world. Here I am, growing, developing, my body feeding off the food provided to me, my brain taking shape from the signals sent to me. It's the perfect place for me to become me, nice and warm, cozy, well, some of the time. You see, even here, so early in my life, sometimes my world can be scary. All the negativity I'm surrounded by starts to shape and change me, even before I'm born. Each experience creates electrical connections in my growing brain. The connections form pathways, and, like a path through a grassy field, the more I tread the same path, the deeper it becomes, and the more likely I am going to take that well-trodden route.
Okay, baby. I know I should be baby, but I'm sure you don't mind this one more hit. This one more hit with me, and then that's it. That's it. You need it, I need it.
I'm not yet born, but it's an unpredictable place. I don't feel secure. The sounds, the voices, things that happen in the environment outside the womb filter through to me. They affect me. They affect my emotions and my development. If you smoke, I smoke. If you drink, I drink. If you take drugs, so do I. I'm getting ready to come into the world, but I already know what it's like to feel frightened. I'll have to fight to survive.
Powerful video, powerful video. Now I'm going to go back to my presentation. Gary, can you see that? It's come back.
Yes, I can see the link.
Yeah, thanks. So we're going to be thinking about baby's home. There are all sorts of assumptions about what life is like. That's why I showed you that video, because we cannot see. We need to hold the baby in mind. We need to think, what is daily life like for this baby? What does baby feel? And I've already talked about it not being about shame, it's being about love. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm not going to say much about fetal programming, but just there's a whole bit of work about the impact of these kind of harmful and hazardous situations and the environment for babies, which is it, and it refers to the way in which the environment in the womb can affect the development of the fetus and can have a significant effect on the child into adulthood and through later life. It's about the fetus's physiological adaptation, and it has all sorts of implications. And although the development of the fetus has a unique genetic blueprint, researchers start to talk about epigenetics, which is that kind of means on top of genetics and involves chemical groups being added to the DNA, which then control whether a particular gene is turned on or off. And that is really what causes the harm. Your genetic blueprint could be that you have the genetics to be 6 foot tall, but if that gene is impacted by the environment in the womb, you might be 5 foot. There are all sorts of aspects about how your genetic blueprint could be impacted by the environment. So baby develops during pregnancy, affected by all these factors which I'm going to be talking about. It's genetic endowment, general health, nutritional status, nutrition during pregnancy. There's huge amounts of work gone on about, and it really worries me at the moment about the cost of living crisis and the kind of situation so many people find themselves in, that this will impact on unborn babies. So it's not just children, but unborn babies in the future, exposure to infection and exposure to external trauma. So, what are these harmful, hazardous environments that the unborn baby live in, and what is the likely impact? And that's difficult, as I said, because we cannot see, and medical tests will not always help, but we do have an evidence base to help us see the unborn baby and understand the impact of stress, depression, drugs, alcohol, domestic abuse. And that's what I'm going to take through now. I haven't got all the reference in because it makes the slides very cluttered, but I've sent you the links for the references and I can add those in if people want them. But I think it is about being able to say what the harm is today. And so first thing is to think about that that all of these kind of hazardous environments have an impact on the baby's vital organs. Their heart, brain and skeleton are all formed in their first 10 to 50 days of pregnancy, and the brain development continues throughout the prenatal period. And it's really, really important for us to be thinking, when we're thinking about harm, what is being formed when we have concerns about drug or alcohol or stress or domestic abuse. And you can see kind of central nervous system, eyes, heart, lower limbs, external genitalia, ears, teeth, palate, all of those are going to be affected by the misuse of drugs, by smoking, by alcohol, and by stress and domestic abuse. And there's a possible impact. We just don't know how those two things come together. So I'm going to focus on 3 core areas: impact on pregnancy, impact on the developing baby, and the impact of attachment, actually. So the first thing is just that we know that the emotional state of a woman in pregnancy can affect the development of her baby in the womb and actually have long-term effects. Research has shown that unborn babies can be affected by, as we've seen in that video, anxiety, stress brought on by natural disasters and trauma. And these children can be likely to have emotional problems, behavioural problems, to be slow at learning, and different children are affected in different ways. And this kind of reminds us as not as a shaming issue, but the really importance of looking after the emotional well-being of pregnant women. And so there are some implications for us of working in this period of time with situations where we are concerned about the well-being of an unborn baby, and we're working with their mother and father to address that, because we've got to get a balance between enabling them to understand what needs to change and what needs to be different, whilst looking after certainly the mother's emotional well-being. So that's the sort of first thing I want you to be thinking about, is how we get that balance is absolutely critical, which includes things like attending meetings, attending child protection conferences, all of those things. What are we doing to kind of help people manage their emotional regulation, relaxing, all of those kind of things, thinking about the emotional state of the woman in pregnancy. What's the impact of stress on the developing baby? So kind of maternal stress, we're seeing neurodevelopmental functioning of newborn babies being impacted, an increase in fearfulness, difficult temperament, sleep problems, and lower cognitive performance. All of those in the kind of short term, when baby is born, will have an impact on attachment and ability to care for a baby. And the outcomes in children aged 3 to 16 years show an increased risk of emotional problems, anxiety, depression, ADHD, and conduct disorder. I'm just going to put that down. And a kind of reduction in cognitive performance. So it's quite some significant impact. Depression is a really big issue in the developing baby, because what we have is the overproduction, and people, women can't help being depressed. It's how we help them deal with that and how seriously we take it, which is the important matter. So helping us understand, and women and partners understand the importance of this, because the overproduction of stress chemicals can reduce fetal growth, poses a risk of premature labour. Recent research has found it's silencing of the gene that regulates the production of stress chemicals. It's linked to altered immune functioning in the baby after birth, evidence that it may affect brain development, and linked to later behavioural and emotional problems in the child at age 4. Severe depression in fathers is quite a significant issue, and has been associated with high levels of emotional and behavioural problems in their infant children, and less involvement with their children and higher rates of infant directed negativity. I'm going to be talking about attachment relationships whilst babies are in the womb, and father's depression can have an impact on that. The impact of serious mental illness such as schizophrenia is kind of related to things like poor attendance and antenatal appointments, unhealthy lifestyles, poor nutrition, smoking, and the effects of both prescribed and illicit drugs. And denial of pregnancy poses a huge risk of problems, and most problematic being the death of a baby. I've done several reviews with people who have had quite serious denial of pregnancy, which led to them denying the pregnancy and wanting the baby to be gone immediately. And so baby has either just been abandoned and died, or deliberately harmed and died. So kind of just thinking about the connections there. I'm going to talk about domestic abuse, but I'm just going to have a bit of a word about domestic abuse and how we can conceptualise it. There's a significant impact of domestic abuse on the unborn baby, but we need to be careful about how we talk about it. This was a significant issue in this local safeguarding practice review I've just done here in Leicestershire, and I'm going to be eradicating the within, the between, in the family, in the relationship, a domestic abuse relationship. So domestic abuse is the misuse of power and control, usually by one person over another with the intention of harming. So we need to be clear about who is responsible for the harm, what is the harm, and what does coercion and control by that person look like. Now, in Leicestershire, you have developed the Johnson's typologies. I haven't got time to go through that, but you have a brilliant domestic abuse toolkit. Go and have a look at it. But it makes clear that most domestic abuse is the misuse of power and control by one person over another. So when we say there's domestic abuse within the family, what we suggest is everybody's involved, and we don't make clear who is responsible for all the harm or where the coercion and control lives. When we say within the couple or between the couple, we imply that it's equal and they're both involved. And within domestic abuse, that's very, very rare. We may be, or we may be seeing different patterns of that, but we just need to be clear about that. And there is no such thing as a domestic abuse relationship, because it's an adult being domestically abusive to another adult. So really, really important that we get that right, to support women who are being subject to domestic abuse, and to support and to kind of hold perpetrators who are responsible for domestic abuse. Can be women, can be men, most likely in pregnancy it's women. We need to hold them to account. So I guess I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but we know that the risk of domestic abuse is heightened during pregnancy, and so evidence of 20 to 30% of women experiencing physical violence during pregnancy. 36% of women report verbal abuse, 14% severe physical violence, and approximately 20% of pregnant women report sexual violence. For some women, it starts in pregnancy. For others, it escalates in terms of frequency and severity. We need to have a sense of the timeline, the pattern of it. What's this woman's experience of domestic abuse and violence? What does it look like for them? What's the implications for the pregnant? What's the implications for them? Actually, in some cases, physical violence stops during pregnancy. But it's important to remember that it does not indicate the abuse itself has stopped. It's simply the physical manifestations of it. You're still likely to see coercion and control. And I've put a very, very, and in such case, it's likely that the violence will start against once the baby is born. So really important that we remember that. And I've put a link in the slides that you'll get to the kind of 10 stages to domestic homicide written by Jane Monckton Smith, which gives you a really, really clear outline of the kind of role of coercion and control. And although it's not cheery reading, I would recommend it. So what's the impact of domestic abuse on the developing baby? Children exposed to violence in early childhood be more vulnerable to difficulties in managing emotions, responding well in social interactions, a whole range of health difficulties. Because domestic abuse raises the woman's stress level, they produce high levels of the stress hormone, and this is the hormone that enables our body to ready itself to respond to danger, and the triggers are fight or flight. And exposure to high level of cortisol in the womb has been found to have a significant effect on the developing child. The baby's brains develop rapidly and impact on fetal brain development. You saw that in the video, how the kind of neuro pathways were being impacted. Impact on pregnancy is poor physical health outcomes for women, sexually transmitted infections, miscarriages, early birth, neonatal death, and low birth weight babies. Low birth weight babies will have an impact on the baby's development. And remembering that kind of mental stress of abuse is far worse than the physical effects of beatings, and impact on self-esteem, impacting on sense of self, and the understanding that the consequences of heightened maternal stress extends to the fetus. So I've kind of already said that. We talked about low birth weight, prematurity, and the risk that baby will die. It's also really important that control over pregnancy, the impact of the mother on the mother and attachment, comes in that the control over pregnancy can also be used as a tool of abuse. So women can be forced to have more children than they want, to go on with pregnancies that they don't want, and It's because an abuser can use a woman's pregnancy as a way of increasing her dependency and intensifying their control over that. That's very much part of the pattern of coercion and control. And women who experience domestic abuse report higher than average rate of unintended pregnancy. And that kind of has an impact on maternal confidence. Domestic abuse is often target women's mothering, often explicitly commenting they'll not be good enough parents, that they are bad women. And there is then a whole sense of kind of how women perceive the unborn baby. Women may worry that the baby they're carrying might grow up to be like their abusive partner. And they may feel they have no choice and this can understandably impact on their ability to feel loving towards their baby. So we're going to move on to think about the impact of drugs on the baby in the pregnancy. Drugs are really significantly important here. They can be harmful to any unborn baby at any time during the pregnancy. Drugs taken during the first trimester can produce congenital malformations, and the riskiest period is from the 3rd to the 11th week of pregnancy, so really important we're keeping an eye out for that. Drugs taken during the 2nd and 3rd trimester can affect the growth and development of the baby, and they can have an absolute toxic effect on the baby's tissues. Drugs given before the term during labour can have an adverse effect on the labour or the newborn baby after they're born. All kind of a whole range of drugs. I'm not necessarily going to go all through these, but that different drugs do have different impacts. Cocaine brings babies who are born smaller and more distressed, reduced supply of oxygen through the placenta. Baby may die, baby may have abnormalities and much greater risk of cot death. And that's a theme that crosses all the misuse of drugs, including cigarettes, which we'll come to. They may go through withdrawal after birth, and cocaine is also linked to the heart defects in the baby and learning difficulties as they grow up. It may cause the baby to have a stroke whilst in the womb. And it causes high blood pressure for mothers, and there's an increased risk of miscarriage, premature early birth, placental abruption after birth, and coming away from the womb. Again, opiates like heroin, methadone and morphine cross the placenta to the baby with great ease. As you know, the baby can become addicted and go through withdrawal after birth, and that was certainly the issue in the review we did. There's a huge risk of pregnancy complications, premature birth and birth defects. If mothers are injecting heroin, they risk getting HIV by sharing needles, and there's high risk of passing the virus onto the baby, something we need to think about. Again, we've got prematurity, low birth weight, miscarriage, and the further increased sudden infant death. With benzodiazepines, these are all the other ways they're called. There's higher chance of a baby being born with a cleft palate. There's a high dose use prior to delivery can seriously affect the baby's breathing, which can lead to death. And they, again, baby may have withdrawal, and then baby is likely to be a poor feeder, finding it difficult to suck, and poor attachment, difficult to manage, and greater risk of cot death. Cannabis, when mixed with tobacco, is again leads to low birth weight and again increased risk of prematurity and miscarriage, and does reduce the supply of oxygen to the baby through the placenta, which increased risks of cot death and early health problems such as asthma in baby. And that's probably connected more to the smoking. So I'm going to go on to talk about, ecstasy also has an impact, all these drugs, but I'm going to just talk about alcohol use. Alcohol is seen as the most dangerous compound for babies, probably more serious than most of the illegal drugs that we've just spoken about. The more women drink, the greater the amount passed on to their baby, and there is just something about imagining what it's like to have great quantities of alcohol raining down on the womb. What does that look like? What does that feel like? And again, we've got the same kind of outcomes. We've got risk of premature birth. We've got poor children's outcomes, poor attention, hyperactivity, and I mean, it says that there's no known safe level of alcohol use in pregnancy, and stopping completely is advised. Really important that we think about fetal alcohol syndrome, and there is a real continuum of this. It's characterised by fetal growth restriction, low birth weight, reduced head circumference and brain size. There'll be central nervous system problems, cognitive dysfunction, learning difficulties and neurological problems. Often a cluster of distinct facial abnormalities and failure to thrive. So what we know is that there's a whole website about fetal alcohol syndrome, which I've sent you the link to, just thinking about the kind of long-term impact of this on babies' lives. Children exposed to alcohol often show poor attention, even if they don't have fetal alcohol syndrome, and hyperactivity, and this may become evident when they're a few years old. And they're born with feeding difficulties, they're restless, irritable, and that impacts on the attachment. So I've nearly got to the end of this, you'll be glad to know, just because it is a bit unending gloom. But smoking is also has a considerable impact on the unborn baby. Smoking even one cigarette, the mother and baby, there's over 4,000 chemicals. It means less oxygen, and important nutrients cannot reach the baby through the placenta. If a mother smokes or the baby is exposed to smoke, increased levels of the poisonous gas carbon monoxide in her body. The amount of oxygen the baby receives will be restricted, and because of this, the baby's heart is under strain every time a mother smokes. So we're seeing birth defects, sudden infant death syndrome, and increased risk of infant mortality. Secondhand smoking or passive smoking is also really important to address, and we're seeing stillbirth, preterm birth, poor health and growth of baby, low birth weight. The impact on the pregnancy is possible miscarriage, stillbirth, ectopic pregnancies and premature birth and low birth weight. And babies and children whose mothers smoke during pregnancy are at increased risk of asthma, chest and ear infections, pneumonia and bronchitis, psychological problems and performing poorly at school. And finally, there is a huge increased risk of sudden and unexplained death, known as sudden infant death syndrome. And there is about 8 times more likely. And we know that it's quite complicated to predict and address sudden infant death syndrome, but where we acknowledge the hazardous environments that babies live, and smoking being one of the most significant ones, as well as happening to newborn babies, it can happen to infants over 12 months. It's unusual, and the risk is greater if the mother or partner continues to smoke after the baby is born and baby is sharing a bed with a parent. I've done 5 or 6 reviews where this was the issue and the baby died of sudden infant death syndrome, and all these factors were present, and the national panel have done a review about this, which is worth looking at. So stopping smoking reduces all the risks described above, so that's why it's really important. So I'm going to do a quick exercise about change. So I want all of you to get a notepad or a bit of paper, and I want it to be landscaped. Gary, have you got your notepad?
I have.
Excellent. Gary, you see, is my little guinea pig here, helping me feel connected to the real world. Thank you, Gary. So we're going to be talking about change, because all of what we've just talked about is kind of both what's happening to women or what women themselves are doing. And that kind of takes us to thinking about change and how we understand change. So on your bit of paper, I want you to put 5 columns. So it's you probably can't see it. I probably should have done one on as a slide. In the first column, I want you to put something you like doing. And I am going to ask one person to volunteer to take us through this. It just can be something really, really superficial. In the second column, I want you to think about what this thing does for you in terms of meeting your needs. If we were doing this over a longer period of time, I'd be thinking, I guess, be getting you to think about Maslow's hierarchy of need. But just at the moment, think, well, what does this do for me? I like doing this thing. What needs does it meet? In the third column, the reason I get you to write this down is because I use this with people to think about change. In the third column, I'm Jane Riffin saying you can't do this thing you like anymore. What's your immediate response? What are you thinking? What's your cognitive self-talk that will be hidden to me unless I ask you about it? In the next column, I want you to think about, I've told you you've got to stop this, and so I mean that, but I want you to think about something else you could do that would replace the thing you like doing. And the final column is both, does this thing meet the needs that you outlined in column 2? And will it cost you any money, extra money? Will it cost you any extra time that we need to take account of? Okay, I'd quite like someone to unmute, and that would mean you haven't come on off camera as well, on camera, sorry, or actually you don't have to come on camera, but is someone prepared to take us through their 5 columns? I've never done this with so many people on the screen.
I don't mind. If nobody else wants to. Oh, somebody's volunteered. Who's that?
I don't mind. Claire.
Who is it, Claire?
Yes.
Okay, just you then, Claire. Thank you.
Okay, so it'd be dancing.
Dancing, yeah.
Yeah, and it's escapism.
Okay. Do you want to say a little bit more about escapism?
Like basically emptying my head. I'm not thinking about anything else other than what I'm doing, and it's like feeding my enjoyment, like receptors, if you like.
Yeah. Does it help you do your job? Or cope with your job?
I suppose it does in a way. Yeah.
Does it make you feel good about yourself?
Yeah, definitely.
So it kind of like it's almost gets your receptors going, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
It's mainly sort of like the escapism part of it, really. Just
yeah. Okay, so I've told you you've got to stop doing this thing. Be honest, what did you think immediately?
Why?
Yep. Are you prepared to, are you secretly saying to yourself, I might carry on even though Jane's told me not to?
Yeah, well, I probably would, because that's like human reaction, I suppose, really, isn't it? Something. I just want to know why, because it's not actually harming me. It's probably it's quite a positive thing. There are alternatives, but they won't give me exactly the same as what that gives to me.
Yeah. And if would those alternatives be more difficult? Would there be, you'd have to sort of think about cost and time?
A little bit more, yes. So a little bit. So my alternative was like going swimming and going to the gym, which I do anyway. But I probably want to do that more to sort of counterbalance not being able to do the other. There would be a little bit more cost involved and a little bit more time consuming. A bit more. It would eat into my time a bit more.
Lovely, Claire. Thank you for that. I
That's
think
okay.
you've demonstrated very, very clearly that we very, very often are asking people to make change. And we do that we need to understand, and often it's things, you know, not like dancing, which is good for you, but often things that are bad for people. And I'm going to do a quick second exercise on this. But we do genuinely need to think, what needs is this meeting? And if we're going to ask someone to stop doing something, how those needs are going to get met elsewhere, because they go quite deep. As you know, we only spoke for a few minutes, but we can see how important it is to you. And I think there is something about the experience of being told to stop. As I think you said it, Claire, there's kind of human reaction is to think, who the hell is she to tell me what to do? It's kind of a response matter. So we need to address that with people. We need to understand what people are thinking when we ask them to make these changes and kind of make clear those cognitive needs. And then when we replace something, make sure it does actually meet the needs, the first thing what had, and that it isn't more difficult to achieve. So I hope that makes sense to people. I've got one more thing to do. So I'm going to do a second one, which is this one needs, I think, just 5 columns again. And this is just these are just little exercises for you to do with people, actually, to think about change. So the first column is the opposite now. So think of something you do that is bad for you, but you do it anyway. And again, make it reasonably superficial, because I'm going to ask something. Well, it's the person who says they'll do it. In the second column, I want you to think about what are the things you say to yourself to make it okay. So you're doing this thing, you know it's bad for you, but how do you justify it to yourself? What's your internal self-talk on this matter? So despite this internal self-talk, you've decided to give this thing up because you know it's bad for you, and you kind of told everybody about it, and they're all gunning for you to be able to achieve this. So lots of people invested in that change, and then you relapse. What do you say to yourself about the relapse? It was only 4. And the fourth thing is, you'll probably have said some kind of it's just this time kind of things on when you relapse. But what do you really feel inside about the relapse? Okay, does someone want to take us through?
Any volunteers?
Saskia, is that Saskia? You got a hand up?
Go ahead, Saskia.
Whoop. Yep, that's me. Well,
thank you, Saskia.
Hi. My thing is coffee.
Oh yeah.
I absolutely love coffee. But I can't drink too much of it because it kind of sets my vertigo off and I feel a bit sick. But I love coffee.
Oh, I'm with you there, Saskia. So what sort of things do you say to yourself to justify your drinking of the coffee?
There is worse things that I could be doing. in, you know, the greater scheme of things, it's not as dangerous as other things I could be doing.
Do you deserve it?
I think I do, definitely.
I think you do, Saskia, definitely.
Yeah.
As they say, you're worth it.
Yeah, I work hard all day. It gives me that little pick me up. Yeah, really love coffee.
Yep. Okay. So you've decided to give up, but you've relapsed, and everybody's invested in you. So you've got quite a lot of people to please here. What do you say to yourself?
It's been a really hard day. I'm tired. It's only the once, just for today.
Once.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what might you really feel?
Ashamed, really. Yeah.
Sorry?
Ashamed in a way, because, you know, I've given up this thing that I really like, but it's good for me giving it up, and I do miss it.
Mm-hmm. So again, I hope people, thank you, Saskia. I think just make this is when we ask people to change things that are bad for them, we have to understand the internal self-talk. What's the justification? It's the other side of need. It's thinking about kind of understanding the internal self-talk that people have to justify it, just as we've heard from Saskia, and you will have experienced that. And then this final thing of shame and embarrassment and all of that. And these are just things that we need to understand in this change process. So I hope that makes sense to people. I'm aware of time, and I said I'd stop. So I'm just going to do the slides on change. So, and I'm sorry, this is the most not possible to be seen image, but I'm having real problems with my computer and I can't stretch anything at the moment. My cursor isn't working properly, but this is just Procrusta and De Clementi's cycle of change. And really all it's saying is that change is really difficult, that we go through a process of change, which starts with pre-contemplation, that we have to accept there's a problem that requires change. We then need to think about how, think about that a bit more. So having decided there is something that's a problem, we have to think about it, and then we have to make some preparations. It's only then will we take action. But action doesn't always, that action won't always lead to maintenance, and relapse often happens. And people will often go through this cycle. Our job, we often talk about change going from A to B, that we want change, and so we get the change, maintenance of change here immediately. And actually we need to work through the process of change with people, supporting them to think about the need for it. The pre-contemplation is why I did those 2 exercises with you just now, is that's what's helping with the pre-contemplation and contemplation. It's helping you understand what things you like doing and what things you don't like doing mean to you, and what the implications would be of the needs not being met, and if you were told not to do it. So that's helping with pre-contemplation. People who've been to my neglect training will be familiar with this, which is that this is a bit of work by Jan Harworth, where she quite rightly suggests that we both need commitment to change and effort. So people have to understand the need for change, and they have to do something about it. So it's not good enough to say, I understand the need for change, and for us to think that that will lead to change. We have to see people doing stuff around that. What we often see is people say, and in the review I've just done, we saw someone who said they were committed to change, but actually made very little effort to undertake that change in reality. Continue to drink, continue to smoke, and not continue to drink, continue to smoke and continue to take drugs. Some people kind of say, I don't see the need for change, but because of compliance, I will go along with it. If you haven't got that internal commitment to it, going along to kind of drug and alcohol services or kind of domestic abuse programs for perpetrators, if they don't understand the need to change, the impact on the unborn baby, we won't see any change. So this is just a way of thinking about, we've got genuine commitment comes from high commitment and high effort. Sometimes we see high commitment but low effort. Sometimes we feel high effort but low commitment, and quite often we have to acknowledge where there's no commitment and no effort, there will be no change. And finally, and then we'll have a break here, is that we need to see change in the context of love and care, not processes, systems and coercions. It's really interesting for someone like me who does a lot of serious case reviews and local child safeguarding practice reviews, that we tend to talk about the need to change in these kind of process ways. So professionals will talk to families about if you don't change, you'll get social work involvement, or there'll be an escalation to child protection. And that kind of feels like a threat from an external force. And external forces are not very good motivators of change, because we've just seen that it's all about our internal understanding of the need for change, not external threats that will help us. So it needs, and I'm not sure I want to be seen as a social worker as a kind of threat that if people don't change, they'll get me coming round their house. And we need to stop doing that. We need to stop, seeing social work as something that happens, because people haven't done what they're supposed to do. And change needs to be felt as an internal motivation. So we need to be thinking about it, is that if change does not happen, your unborn baby will be, that should say harmed, not hammed, and unhappy. And now this is where my cursor problems came in this morning, and we'll need to think about the best way to help and address this. So connecting change to a relationship of love and care. If you don't change, or if your family circumstances don't change, that will impact on your child's long-term health, well-being and development. And we will need to do something about that. This is both kind of makes more internal sense, but it also tests out people's ability to hold their child in mind and reminds them that this is the goal that we're intended to. We're wanting them to make change in the best interest of their children, and that children see them making change as a demonstration of love. Now, the unborn baby won't know that, but they will know that in the future. And it promises sort of better attachment if you feel like you can start difficult things for the best interest of your child. I do hope it's all making sense. It's really difficult to ask that question of 100 or so people, and I picked up some of the questions. Claire, one of the people involved in the review, has just highlighted that there are a few little errors in the beginning of the PowerPoint of the case that we reviewed, and I'll change those, Claire, before I send things out. I must admit I was focusing on everything else, and I probably did that in more than a hurry that I should, so apologies. And then there are other questions, and we'll get that. I'm going to try and get through some of this quite quickly, so to leave enough time for questions. So, and it's interesting that we've been talking about, and I am trying to highlight the world of the unborn baby, but very, very well aware of the world of the parents that we're talking about here. And of course, trauma is the kind of background noise here. And I think I was really interested in one of the questions about kind of therapeutic work during pregnancy as opposed to waiting till after. And I completely agree with that, being traumatized means continuing to organise your life as if the trauma was still going on, unchanged and immutable, as every new encounter or event is contaminated and influenced by the past. So trauma isn't in the past, it's in the present, as we know. I'm sure I'm telling you things you already know, but it's just a reminder of that. And just, we know that there is significant evidence regarding the negative long-term developmental effect of abuse and neglect of children by their primary caregivers or family members, and this is called either complex trauma, relational trauma or developmental trauma. I'm really recommending the work of Karen Treisman on this. She has written so fantastically about that, but this trauma, which takes place in the context of family relationships, it's fundamentally different from single incident trauma experienced by people who were previously coping and developing appropriately. And I'm probably just quickly going to go through this because I found this in a resource website run by Research in Practice, looking at repeat removals of children from parents. And there's a lot of work going on around that, and there's a really nice video in there, and I'll add that to the slides as a link. But talking about the differences between single incident trauma and complex relational trauma, and the differences are that single incident trauma, sexual abuse, sexual assault, rape, a whole range of things, invokes fear, and you can learn to overcome that fear over time. You can habituate. But for complex relational trauma, the experience is actually one of shame, and actually it's very, very difficult to get rid of that shame, to do anything about it unless it is targeted directly. Single incident trauma comes out of the blue. You weren't expecting it by definition. But for those in complex relational trauma, it's very, very, very predictable. It happens often, you know it's going to happen, and it invokes feelings in why didn't I do something about it? Why didn't I stop it? A sense of hopelessness, a sense of powerlessness. Single incidents are very specific to a circumstance, but for complex relational trauma, they're generalised to all circumstances. Most single incident trauma, we're talking about happening to adults with their adult minds, whereas complex relational trauma happens to children who haven't got the cognitive capacity to make sense of it. And I think most importantly that where single incident trauma happens, you're talking about a restoration of normal development, whereas actually in here we're talking about the creation of healthy development. So there's just kind of some of the differences. And I think it's just thinking about kind of what people do to cope with let me come back to that. You know, what we know is that children develop adaptive responses to abnormal circumstances, and these adaptations, so actually sometimes what children do feels normal to them in their abnormal circumstances, but these adaptations can be seen by the outside world as maladaptive, and over time can become maladaptive. So let's try and think about the source of some of these adaptations. I just did a review where a adolescent was taught to steal food from the age of 4, and she continued, and that helped her cope with neglect and build relationships with a grandmother who wanted her to do it, and being asked to do it was maladaptive, but doing it felt adaptive to survival. But in adolescence, in an adoptive home, it was seen as completely different issue. Strategies survivors develop for self-protection, combined with post-traumatic stress and hyperarousal and avoidance, makes survivors' entrance into a service setting seem fraught with danger. And what we know is that people with complex trauma often have an over perception of threat or hostility. So what seems to us like a warm, responsive greeting can feel very, very different. And your body can take longer to recover from the fear response. So coming into contact with our services is quite difficult. And people experience denial, disassociation, avoidance and substance misuse, you know, a flight response. Finding it hard to regulate, self-regulate, mentalize, think about your own feelings, thinking about the feelings of others. And sometimes we have fight, aggression, hostility, or shame, self-isolation. So thinking about what are the responses here that we are seeing. And quite often people will learn to reduce their emotions, to kind of respond more slowly, and to kind of and start to think, I'm okay, I've recovered from my trauma, I've recovered from the past, and I'm just needing to contain my emotions. And that can mean people come across as a little emotional less, and we can see that as disengagement as opposed to kind of responding to trauma, trying to deal with these kind of stressful situations, and we need to help people with that. I think it's really important for us to see this kind of cycle that we're in, which is that, you know, we've got a baby in the womb who's experienced all these issues, an unattached infant, emotional and behavioural problems in childhood, adolescent offending, exploiting, abuse. Then we have an adult with complex needs, a parent of concern, and around to an unattached infant. And actually all of us at all the stages have to kind of make sense of the whole, rather than we have services which deal with each individual bit of it, but what we have is an increasingly punitive approach and an increasingly triggering approach often for people, which is why trauma-informed services are so important at all stages here. And I just quite like this kind of slide, which is that all of us are often just looking at one bit of the picture, aren't we, rather than seeing the whole picture. And this slide is just meant to represent that. When we look at one bit of the picture, we can label it as one thing, and we need to step back and think it's not a spear, it's an elephant. And I just thought this quote was just, you know, summed it all up really, that trauma devastates the social engagement system and interferes with cooperation and the ability to function as a productive member of the clan. We've seen how many mental health problems, from drug addiction to self-harm, start off as attempts to cope with emotions that become unbearable because of a lack of adequate human contact, but many institutions and services focusing on suppressing unpleasant emotions and troublesome behaviours. So everything needs to be seen in a trauma-informed approach, and I've got about 10 minutes to talk about pre-birth assessment. So I'm not going to say huge amounts about the kind of what lies behind it. I'm just going to pick up some key themes. So there's a lack of a national approach, inconsistencies in using and what the focus is, but Leicestershire, Leicester and Rutland, there's a CSE, Leicestershire Children's Services have a framework and a guidance, and so do Leicester, the partnership, and they've both been updated. So make sure you're aware of those, and we can send you the links, and they're both being updated in the light of a number of different reviews that have been going on. The point I wanted to make about pre-birth assessments is that they often you know, they focus on parents rather than babies. So we all know the range of circumstances that make us concerned about the safety and well-being of an unborn baby, although it's often characterised as a high-risk pregnancy. So watch out for that. Does your guidance say the concern we have here is about the unborn baby, layered with concern about the parent? Does it start with that, so we're keeping the focus on the baby? But these, I'm not going to go through these today because they're clearly contained in your safeguarding procedures. Have a look at that. There's a very good national framework, which is quite complicated and confusing, but has some good material in there, commissioned by the DfE and completed by the NSPCC. And I'm going to focus on some of the key issues they pick up. I'm not going to go through this, but they in the NSPCC bit of work, they redid the assessment framework, and they kind of changed baby's developmental needs, family and home environment, parenting capacity. And I quite liked this as a kind of making sense of the assessment framework, but from a pre-birth perspective, and the baby's developing needs in the womb. The research that they've got in the NSPCC looks at 4 key issues, and I'm going to try very quickly to cover those. Is thinking about the way in which the pregnant woman's life experiences are affecting her pregnancy and her ability to look after her newborn baby, and that's both women and partners, and it involves working with the past in the present, thinking about being able to regulate your emotional state, thinking about the capacity for reflective functioning, and parents' ability to develop an attachment to the baby whilst it's in the womb. So I'm just going to, those are the 4 central kind of research-based issues that any pre-birth assessment needs to think about. You're both understanding it and thinking how you can build on it. So working with past in the present is thinking with pregnant women and their partners about their own experiences of being parented and how it's shaped their feelings about themselves, their ability to relate to others, and specifically the extent to which it's resulted in distorted perceptions, constructions about the fetus and about the baby. What have they brought from the past to the present? And developing an understanding of the way in which their own experiences may have impacted on them, the triggers that may affect their ability to parent. And it's kind of, we need to explore beyond, I was hit as a child, it didn't do me any harm, is thinking, getting them to think about what that might mean for them as children, what they bring from that into parenting. We also need to think about, this wasn't relevant in the review I did here, but I did a review with where 8 children were removed. There were concerns about 8 children and neglect, and the parents had 8 previous children removed, and the assessment didn't take any account of why the previous children had come into care and what the parents thought about that. They kind of just were considered, that piece of work was considered to have been finished. And we need to think about, given this context of repeat proceedings and repeat removals, is reflections on previous children coming to care, parents' sense of responsibility and acceptance of the part they played, internal responsibility rather than external blame, understanding of what needed to change then. So what would have made a difference? What would have helped those children not to come into care, and what needs to change in the light of that to ensure the safety of this child? What needed to change for the safety of the children who came into care? Same thing, I guess. And what empathy exists for those children? Can parents speak to these children's experience, see things from their perspective, understand what life was like for them now and what life might be like now, to kind of have a sense of being able to think about the needs of children. The second thing is kind of thinking about reflective functioning. It's so important, and it's our capacity to envision mental states, thoughts, feelings, needs, desires in oneself and others. And in this context is to keep the unborn baby in mind. And it's defined as the parent's imagined relationship with the baby. It's also the ability to link mental states to behaviour in meaningful and, most importantly, in accurate ways. So reflective functioning is about when someone bumps into you, it's an ability to read why they bumped into you, what their intention was, what your feeling about it is, and thinking about, for some people, accidental bumping into someone can be read as hostility, anger, deliberateness, hatred, and we respond appropriately. Children's need for attention can be seen as needy, interrupting of parents' needs. It's our ability to understand and behave appropriately. And huge inaccuracies, not understanding that a baby is kicking you to say hello is different from a baby kicking you to wake you up in the middle of the night. What are your attributions? What are the attributions that parents have of what the way in which their unborn baby is behaving? And kind of negative distortions really need picking up very, very quickly. It's the importance of these representations is that they are very stable over time. So distorted or disengaged prenatal representations still seem to exist over a year after the baby's born, and they predict preserve parenting behaviours and child attachment at age 1 in a negative way. And women who are experiencing domestic abuse and violence or have substance dependent have significantly more negative representations of themselves as mothers and their infants. And there is a little bit of a kind of framework for understanding that, thinking about women are described for balance, can provide richly detailed, coherent stories about their pregnancies. Women who are disengaged appear to be uninterested in the fetus or the relationship with it and demonstrate few thoughts about the baby. And then we have women described as distorted, tangential or express intrusive thoughts about their own experience as children, often viewing their fetuses primarily as an extension of themselves or their partners. This is just a way of kind of trying to think, where is this mother at the moment and what can I do about it? I've already talked about the long-term impact on attachment, children's development and self-esteem over the lifetime. And I'm not going to go into this, but there are questions that we can invoke reflective functioning. We can get mothers talking to their baby, thinking about the unborn baby, and I've got a number of resources that I'm going to give you. And I'm just hurrying up so that there is a few times for questions. The second thing is just thinking about regulating affect and thinking about how we help people to regulate their emotional states. I'm not going to say much more than that, but we also need to, in the pre-birth assessment process, understand affect regulation, think about what that will mean for the baby, and think about what we do about it in terms of helping people manage their emotional states. And really, really important to do that before the baby is born. Final thing is how we kind of think about developing an attachment to the baby. This is about increased reflective functioning, but it's really important that we're encouraging the prenatal attachment to the infant, that we're talking about the baby as a baby having personality. It's getting people to think about the emotional and physical needs of the infant and plan how they can meet these. And I think it's about helping parents fall in love with a baby, dressing when that love is not there or has gone. And I've got a really nice couple of videos I haven't got time to show you, which is about bonding with your unborn baby. There's about 4 in the slides that I'm going to send you to show to parents about getting them to talk to their baby, sing to their baby, connect with them in some way. So just so I'm finishing on time, to get questions is, I guess my key messages are kind of see the unborn baby. Let's as professionals kind of highlight that they are there, they have needs, and that hazardous, harmful, dangerous environments will impact on them in the future. Understand what their world is like. Let's talk about actual impact rather than likely future impact. We know from the evidence base that there can be impact. We just don't know what that looks like, and we won't know for a long time. Let's have a trauma-informed approach, kind of, seeing the kind of traumatized infant in the adult and thinking about how we work with that. We know that all is quite difficult. It's really important to think about working with the past in the present, thinking about how that trauma is impacting today, and kind of build attachments and love where you can. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to stop the share side. And I'm going to pick up any questions. Sorry, I know that last bit was rushed, but I just wanted to kind of be able to pick up some of the questions. Gary, were you going to curate that? Yep.
I'll go back towards the beginning. We have a question from Claire Tam, but do we need to also consider coercive reproduction within domestic abuse? Many people are not aware of this type of abuse.
I think, Claire, we completely do. I found quite a nice handout on it, which I'm happy to send around to everybody, and I will send to you. It's come up in lots of reviews that I do. I'm just completing one where I can completely see that a mother has had 2 pregnancies in the same year and a termination in that period as well, and needing to ask about that. So I think I did include it in the slide, and it is a really important issue. So yeah, the answer is yes.
And what she's added to that, Jane, is that coercive reproduction is something that's not been well documented, I think, generally, and little training on this part of domestic abuse, as you're saying. So therefore, does this need to be considered in assessments, pre-birth assessments?
I mean, again, that review I talked about, where I reviewed 8 children who'd been removed from their parents' care for significant and serious neglect, and those babies were born eight babies in 8 years, and the mother had 8 previous babies in the previous 8 years, so that's 16 babies in a 16-year period. And the question is, how much coercive, you know, I can't imagine anybody who would want to be pregnant 16 times in 16 years, no year off from it. So what was the role of coercion and control within that? 2 partners. Yep.
Okay, so a question from Emma Bulgin. It's about the slide about impact of domestic abuse on the mother and baby. She's saying, what was the paper that was recommended? I don't know whether you can answer that at the moment.
Yeah, that same paper I think I'm talking about, actually, Gary, and I've referenced it in the slides that people will get. It's a paper from Women's Aid. It's a very good one on domestic abuse and the impact on the mother. Thank
you. There's another one from Anonymous. Whose cycle of change was it about? Change and relapse.
Yeah, it was Prochaska and Di Clemente, and I will put it on the slide and I'll give you a reference. I did that quite quickly this morning, and that's when I was having all my problems with my sticky keys and my cursor, which remain, but without panic, I'll be able to get a slide with that and a reference to people. Really important and a really helpful framework for thinking about this knotty issue of change.
Lovely, thank you. There's another one from Claire Turnbull. She's saying, is this what is used in the work being done to ask women to take contraception where they have had previous children removed? I can't remember the programme, but it has been successful.
Yeah, so that's the Pause programme, Claire. It's quite controversial, but it has been incredibly successful. There is, I've put the site from Research in Practice in the references I'm sending you, and there is a huge amount of resources. The Nuffield Observatory are doing huge amounts of work on repeat removals. We've got such a lot of them, and you know, these are children who are then being adopted or fostered with long-term consequences around their emotional and attachment needs, and it's something we've really got to get to grips with. So there are a couple of programmes, but Pause is the most well-known one. But I'd really recommend people looking at the Research in Practice and the Nuffield Observatory, and I'll make sure those references are there.
Thank you. There is a question missing that Helen Pearson put in, but it's disappeared. Are you still there, Helen? Helen Pearson? Would you like to ask it?
Unfortunately, I've just been to the dentist, so I'm not really able to talk very well. But I've actually.
Oh, you!
I have put another question in. Has it not?
No, I can't see it.
It says it's been successfully submitted to the moderator.
Right, let me check you.
No, it's not there.
It wasn't there. No, still
I
not
think
there, I'm afraid, Helen. But if you want to,
I can see it. It is important to understand the mother's cognitive ability to understand concept of pregnancy, physical changes, birth, and baby's needs. Understanding, retaining, and acting on information on advice.
Yeah. Thank you, Helen. I know exactly what you mean. It's unusual for me not to have put anything in here about learning disability and learning difficulty, partly because it wasn't part of this review, and I just didn't quite have the time to cover it. But you're absolutely right that women who have learning disabilities will need help and support to kind of understand the needs of the unborn baby, the changes to their body, the implications of that. There are some good resources from an organisation called Change around easy read versions of pregnancy I could put one of the references to that, but it is our responsibility as professionals to make reasonable adjustments under the Equalities Act 2010 for adults with learning disabilities, so that any reports that we give to people must be able to be read by them. We don't have good systems in place to do that. Working agreements, kind of contracts, assessments, child protection plans. Most of it, if not adapted, is an absolute mystery to people, and it's a large bit of work that needs to be done. I've just done far too many reviews where parents have been asked to understand very, very small writing, very, very complex words, complex paragraphs, and it often, Helen, I think what you're thinking is that we often see women giving birth unexpectedly because they can't read the signals of their body. They don't understand what's going to happen. Often don't understand they're pregnant for some time. So that's another really important consideration. Thank you.
Okay, I can't say any more unless you want to take any questions. Just people want to put their hand up and ask a question. There's no more in the chat. Did somebody speak? Daria, can you say any more in the chat?
No.
I mean, we've got from Martin, Emma, I think the cycle of change also uses motivational interviewing, and I think that's absolutely right. That can be really, really, really helpful as a process. I mean, we don't have to have a question if people have got a comment or a reflection. I know it's quite difficult to do, like in a very large group, but we have got a few minutes.
I'd like to add something. I think Claire Turnbull's got a hand up. Do you want to go ahead, Claire?
Sorry, you can trust me, can't you?
We can. That's brilliant.
So the NSPCC national report tool that you referenced earlier, Jane, I thought it was absolutely excellent, but my background is not social work, and it felt to me quite social worky, if that's a term. And we're doing a task and finish group to re-look at the pre-birth assessment, and the thing that really shone out for me was that adapted pre-birth assessment triangle, which I think is really useful. So I guess my question is, there seem to be a lot of processes within that NSPCC guidance, and because I cover Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland, it's about thinking about how do we decide which tools we use. If we're writing a multi-service process and procedure, how do we bring together 3 local authorities and decide which tools we're going to use?
Yeah, I do think the NSPCC is excellent. When you get into the detail of it, it's quite complicated. And one of the things we're finding about tools is things like the graded care profile 2 and any of the neglect tools, mine included, is that there is both a kind of resource problem of people having time to do it, people's reluctance to do it, and the simpler the better seems to be. I think it is thinking about, I think so what the NSPCC has a whole range of tools, including cycle of change, capacity to change. I picked out what I thought were the most important ones, which is the kind of working with the past in the present, the things I've just said really, and kind of thinking about what are the core issues. So those are the things I'd get people focusing on: reflective functioning, assessment, capacity to change, impact, all those things like domestic abuse.
That's really helpful. That's really helpful, because I think if we're doing an overarching multi-agency procedure, we need to be looking at those themes and then seeing evidence of those. So I think those 4 key areas are really important. Thank you.
Yeah,
that's really
understanding helpful. Attachment, seeing the baby. I think for me, that's what's come from doing this review and a couple of babies who've died, a couple of other babies that died, is that as professionals, we we can forget that it's a baby there, and we can then not focus parents on that baby. And it's what people said about the kind of therapeutic work in preparation for babyhood, because given these babies are going to be born being irritable, you can see from domestic abuse, alcohol, cigarettes and drugs all bring babies with additional early needs for care, and then parents who are stressed at those early days, so who have kind of reduced capacity to deal with somebody else requiring their attention. So if we haven't tackled that, how are you going to deal with that? How do you feel when someone demands your attention? How do you cope with that? How did you cope when other children needed your attention? What did you do about that? How do you manage your affect with that? It's not really surprising that we've got so many children who are dying at a young age. Yeah, sorry, Claire, you come back again.
No, I think that's really, really helpful. And I guess what we need to start to think about is that during the pregnancy, when we have time, say with early help and social workers working with the family, to then think about what we think would be appropriate evidence to evidence the work on change that parents have done, or the work that they've done to be reflexive. Because I think, well, those themes I agree with, and the work and the NSPCC and the framework, but then we need to be able, I suppose, to be able to take to court, if that's what we need to do, something that shows what either has been successful or hasn't been successful, because we've got the evidence base there, but then it's like, well, yeah, okay, but how are we going to measure it? We've got to do it, and we've got to measure it.
Well, and that's why I think being able to, I mean, I think where previous children have been removed, understanding things from those children's perspective, understanding what you would have done differently, and understanding what needs to be done differently for these children, are all holding the child in mind. And we really need to test people's ability to do that. We so often, in that work, the case I talked about with the 8 children being removed and 8 previous children, in that situation, when parents, whenever they're asked at all about the 8 children, they said they happened because professionals were horrible people, and they didn't, you know, they could not, they could only see external threat, not internal. We perhaps, you know, didn't, and they moved constantly. Those children had, both sets of children, global developmental delay. They didn't go to school. They were all in nappies till they were 10, all sorts of stuff. And we didn't focus enough on what the parents thought about the children's needs. So that's for me where one of the most, you know, so that's keeping a child, we can focus on helping people to see the child in mind, but we also need to test it as well. And then the affect regulation, I think, is also a really important part of that, because if you can't manage your regulation for yourself and with the professionals that you work with, it's going to be really hard to do that with a small baby. So sort of a little bit of a focus on that is really important. Hope that helps.
It really helps. And I think in the case that you're talking about, obviously I know quite well, there was quite a lot of information that the nurses were picking up on the ward before the baby was discharged. You know, so it's about thinking about how we share that appropriately and monitor. But yeah, that's been fantastic. Thank you very much.
Yep. Anybody else?
If I could just add something, Claire, what I'd like to say is we've concentrated on this case that you've talked about today. There's been a number of cases throughout the COVID period, really, the last couple of years, where the cases that have been referred to us have highlighted vulnerabilities in mothers, in pregnant mothers, around what Jane's been talking about: substance misuse and learning disability, homelessness. There's been a number of themes. And it's really highlighted how COVID has affected young mothers where they haven't got a good sort of family support network. So there's been some really good work done by professionals and frontline people, but we've really noticed how much we need to concentrate on those small percentage of people to try and keep the babies safe. And we are doing work. Claire Turnbull has just been speaking, is chairing a task and finish group. And we're looking at a number of identified learning points from a number of case reviews across Leicester City and Leicestershire. So there's some good work going on, and we're just trying to improve that as we go through the sort of post-COVID period. So just some reassurance, really. I hope that's reassured you.
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, today is about raising awareness. It's not a kind of deficit model. It's really that what should we be interested in? And, you know, there's some fantastic work going on across Leicestershire, Leicester City and Rutland and across the country. We know that. And just sometimes it's good to be reminded that these cases, very sad cases that come up, just gives us a chance to stop, think, well, you know, what's important here, and refocus on that. And, you know, Leicestershire have really done that, and the LLR partnership has done that, and that's fantastic. I do think going forward, the cost of living crisis is going to be the next big challenge. And if COVID was a challenge, you know, I don't need to tell anybody on this call that that's going to be our next thing. Impact on well-being. The impact on pregnancy is going to be huge, and we are going to be, you know, in terms of nutritional needs of the unborn baby is huge. And if people can't feed themselves, you know, what are the implications of that? And then what are the implications for how mothers see themselves, because they know that they aren't meeting their baby's needs, and they know that that's, you know, that's an easy one, really. They know that that will have an impact, and it can kind of, it may well have an impact on how they feel about themselves as mothers, their self-esteem, their confidence. If babies haven't had enough food, and you'll often see people smoking to reduce stress in this moment, you know, then you're doing something to reduce their stress, drinking, smoking. That's why I go back to what needs does it meet. If we will really need to understand that, because otherwise that will impact on the reflective functioning, ability to be able to see the baby, and when looking after a baby who will have additional, you know, will be a bit kind of irritable and a bit difficult. So kind of following through on that. So thinking about the psychological impact of the cost of living crisis, as well as the social and emotional, I think it's going to be really important. That's so uncheery, isn't it?
Just one point, Claire. Sorry, Jane. Vaping, is that just as bad as smoking, or?
The jury's a bit out on the evidence about vaping, actually. They don't know what the toxins in the vape, so there's not been any research on the toxins. So, you know, smoking cessation is recommended, and vaping isn't recommended because we don't know, and there's no doubt that we're likely to find that out. In
time to come.
Time to come.
Yeah. Thank you.